Good afternoon. My name is Franco Montalto from Drexel University. Welcome to the November 2020 edition of Green Infrastructure, Climate, and Cities, a multidisciplinary set of webinars that focus on the unique impacts of climate change on cities. For those of you joining us for the first time, this is a series of monthly seminars that go back to 2014. They've been recorded and archived on the CC-RUN, the Consortium for Climate Risks in the Urban Northeast, the NOAA-funded RISA. Our CC-RUN website has archived all of the previous Green Infrastructure, Climate, and Cities seminars going back to 2014, and they can be accessed on our website. These seminars are held on the first Wednesday of every month. Prior to COVID, there was both in-person and online viewing possible. Right now, we're 100% online, and we're happy to have you here. In today's presentation, you can submit questions via the Q&A box. You can also, if you see a question that has been submitted by others that you think is relevant, you can upvote that question. You can also raise your hand, and we will call on you in the Q&A to ask your question verbally. The chat box is reserved for comments if you're having trouble connecting, these types of things, and they may not necessarily be seen in the Q&A. Those of you who are seeking continuing education credits, please make sure to send us the relevant information as indicated in the invitation. So today's topic is climate resilience in the cities of Newark, New Jersey, and Baltimore, Maryland. And we have a series of presentations, so 2 speakers from Newark and 2 speakers from Baltimore. The format today will be, we will go through the 2 speakers from Newark first, then we'll do Q&A for the Newark speakers, and then we'll do the 2 speakers from Baltimore. We'll do Q&A for them, and then if there's time permitting, we'll have general conversation at the end. We'll be ending at 5:45 today. So with that, let me introduce our 2 speakers from Newark. So the first speaker is Nathaly Agosto Filión. She's the Chief Sustainability Officer for the City of Newark and the city's leading sustainability strategist, convening interdepartmental teams to make Newark a cleaner, greener, healthier, better prepared, and more engaged cities. She also serves as a bridge linking a network of community, academic, institutional, philanthropic, and governmental partners who are jointly advancing a variety of sustainability, greening, environmental health, and quality of life initiatives across Newark. Nathaly will be followed by Halimah Shabazz, who's an environmental specialist with the City of Newark's Water and Sewer Utilities Department. Halimah is the Water Department's first in-house environmental specialist, and she focuses on planning, policy, community outreach, and forestry management. She joined the department last August when it was in the throes of the lead water crisis and hit the ground running with community meetings to inform the public of the solutions that were underway. So with that, I will hand it over to the Newark team, I think beginning with Nathaly, and I will stop sharing. Nathaly, it's yours.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you for that. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, I will get started. Thank you for having Newark invited to be part of this CC-RUN presentation series, and also for this opportunity to sort of share a little bit about some high-level thoughts that we have around the work that we're doing, the plan for the impacts of climate change, and in particular, we'll spend most of our remarks talking about green infrastructure deployment in the city. So my name is Nathaly Agosto Filión. I'm the Chief Sustainability Officer for the City of Newark. And in that capacity, as was shared previously, I essentially work to help all of the various department directors advance our citywide sustainability agenda. I did see that there was a chat that came in, but I'm not going to read them while I'm talking. So if there's anything that I need to be aware of, can Corinne or Franco, would one of you guys just give me a heads up if I have to?
Sure.
Okay. So this question of how to get sort of various folks together to come together for a similar purpose and to pull in the same direction, I think is a particularly important one, and it's going to be the frames for some of the remarks that I have prepared today around sort of process. The reason I want to focus in that question of sort of high-level takeaways about how to go about doing this work is that we are very much in our planning phases right now for completing our first ever climate action plan. So while we've had sustainability action plans in the past, which I'll get into, and we'll continue to have one, we want to make sure that we're sort of upholding the Paris agreements, and we are still in, and the other things, and we're in the middle of that. I wanted to start first by giving just a little bit of an overview and background on Newark, and this is, I think, kind of a cute way of showing the diversity of what Newark is and what Newark has been for many years. We're located just at, not too far from New York City, so there's a lot of ways in which you think about the city that and the way the city's footprint is designed that comes from that sort of past and legacy of where we're located and the industrial history that we have. We have just under 300,000 in population, and we're a fairly small footprint city for being one of the 100 most populous cities in the country. So we have about 25 square miles of very densely populated urban northeast city with a good substantial chunk of that, close to a third, depending on how you think of it, being made up of the port of Newark and the airport. So we've had a sustainability office in various iterations since 2008, I want to say. I'm like the third sort of director level person in this position. And early on, we wanted to make sure that we were centering the work of our office in meeting community needs. And so this policy framework of ensuring that all of our work advances public health, ensures quality of life for our residents, and provides opportunities for green jobs and green economic development while saving money for the city and our residents and stakeholders in general. Those are sort of our guiding principles. That's what we're constantly aiming for. And I flag that because as we developed it, when I started in 2016, late 2016, and inherited what at that time was an almost 5-year-old sustainability action plan, those values maintained and continued to be sort of central. One thing that I found particularly interesting, and I'll share here for folks, I know it's a fairly mixed audience, I found it very interesting that in all of the various ways of having stakeholder engagement sessions, the words climate and climate action and climate change and global warming very rarely came up. In Newark, when we talk about sustainability action plan, we're using terms that are accessible to folks like healthy and prepared. So while this chapter of our 2020 Sustainability Action Plan focuses on climate preparedness and resilience in terms that many folks in sort of the practitioner realm are very familiar with, we tried to make it as simple as possible. So we want to be prepared so that we're healthier, safer, and more prosperous, even in the face of anticipated climate and changes. And then even just the use of the word green was something that we really had to reflect on because, greening cities and green jobs or green economic opportunity, there's sort of a buzz to that often means that people don't exactly know what you're talking about. I can't tell you the number of times when I started, and I don't know to what extent my colleagues who are on this call have also had this, this experience is what is sustainability? What do we mean by sustainability? And so we sort of brought it back to the basics. So our green chapter is literally about adding greenery to our neighborhoods through green infrastructure, trees, and parks. And while this is a draft, actually, this is the first time I'm sharing this flyer, this one pager in a public setting. We're coming to the end of our 2020 Sustainability Action Plan implementation process, and so this is our sort of end of year report out on some of the green infrastructure work, which you'll hear a lot more from Halimah. So we wanted to, our target goal was to sort of maximize the use of green infrastructure on public property so that we could empower folks to use these strategies for stormwater management, heavier storm events being one of the biggest climate impacts that we're planning for and preparing for. So what comes next? I started 2020 very excited, like I think many of us, and excited about possibilities and excited about this big milestone year. And I think we've been on roller coasters of our own personal roller coasters, but also, you know, just sort of riding the wave of everything that's happening around us. And so I wanted to share a few sort of principles for how we want to go about our action planning work into the future. The first is this idea of bringing people together who maybe don't see themselves as working in the same direction or pulling in the same direction. Many cities across the country have offices of sustainability that are fully encapsulated within one unit. The approach in Newark is to have a centralized office that then serves as the connector between many different departments. And so this issue of people having their own agenda, or there not being sort of a centralized way of thinking, is something that's constantly a battle for us internally in terms of picking our priorities. This is figuring out the best way to help people see the connections and work together is a big part of the work. This other related theme has to do with this concept of us being in various kinds of bureaucracies, whether it's government, whether it's academia. In fact, even many parts of the nonprofit sector can be very siloed and separated from one another. And so I call out this particular challenge precisely because many of the sustainability and climate practices that we're trying to advance are themselves multidisciplinary and cut across themes and boundaries, resilience being a huge one. This idea of working with the folks that are already your bright spots and activating them. I wanted to call on this because as we're moving forward into our climate action planning work in what will now be 2021, unfortunately, I'm working with the Newark Green Team, our Newark Environmental Commission, and many other kinds of partners to do our big C climate work in a way that is going to make people respond, right? If nobody says global warming and nobody says climate action that you just meet, then how do we phrase this in a way that is accessible? And these partners are among the folks that can help increase the accessibility of the kind of wonky stuff that we're trying to get done. And then iterating this idea that you can't just, there's not one way to nail Jello to a wall. I love some of these analogies precisely because they show you the problem statement, right? And this idea that it's sort of sometimes ill-defined problem that you're trying to address, and many different ways of sort of solving an issue. You need to sort of approach it that way. And I like this analogy as well, precisely because of the fact that so many different actors are approaching this work in so many different ways. I'm going to close with this concept of decentralization, which I've already sort of flagged a couple times, because of the fact that I don't think we can do this work without finding those bright spots and letting folks iterate and lead from the ground. This comes back to some of the principles that I shared at the very top around, sort of people defining and doing this work in their own way. I'm really proud and excited to be standing alongside Baltimore here, who I'm sure will go into many details about the various iterations that they've had of their climate action planning work, because I think this question of whether or not everything has to be led out of sort of a single vision, or whether you can do what is essentially in my mind a principle of a just transition, which is empower. And I struggle with that word empowerment. You're not giving people power, they have their own power and they're using it, right? So decentralization is the last sort of theme that I wanted to pull out in terms of how our climate action planning will move forward. my opening remarks, I recognize and understand, have been fairly sort of open-ended in a lot of ways. And I do want to be able to come back here in a year and give you guys a lot more detail about the various projects that we have underway. For now, I feel like I think this is a bit of a reflection of where my personal headspace has been at in the last several months, but then also trying to ready ourselves for our climate action planning work to be, grounded and centered in the work that Newark has underway. So less of the details, which I'm grateful to have my colleague Halimah speak a little bit about the work that the water department is leading, but just more generally speaking, how we struggle, I guess, sometimes to bring this work to people. And I just love this this comic and have loved it for many years. It's a big way that sort of it's a big driver of the work that I do, is that I don't really care on a personal level what is driving people to show up to the table. So we are the ones we've been waiting for, and we're ready to sort of do this work together. Thank you.
Thank you, Nathaly. I guess we will hand it over to Halimah.
Thank you, Franco. Thank you, Nathaly. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Okay, so we can hear. The screen is up. Okay. My name is Halimah Shabazz. I am an environmental specialist with the City of Newark Water and Sewer Utilities Department. I've been with the department for a year now, and when I started, the lead service line replacement program was just starting. Residents needed information, and a big point in getting their lead service line replaced was education. They needed to know, how does this affect them? How does this affect their children? What's the future going to look like after their service lines are replaced? And I played a big part in getting them the most accurate information available. We also partnered with various organizations, including the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection and the Department of Health.
Halimah, sorry, could I interrupt you for a quick sec? Do you mind going into presentation mode?
Oh my goodness, I'm so sorry.
No, you're fine. That's great. Thank you.
Okay.
It's just taking us. Okay,
go.
yeah, it's perfect.
Apologies. So I also work in various sustainability projects and initiatives that support community outreach and partnership with local environmental nonprofit groups. Okay, so the Department of Water and Sewer Utilities was created in 1994 in a reorganization of the city government, and Newark's water supply has always been its most valuable asset. So the department has been very responsible in managing its water resources and supplying water efficiently and cost effectively while remaining in compliance with state and federal regulations. So again, our lead service line replacement program, to date, we are at 15,799, and this number changes probably hourly. By the end of tonight, there'll be a new number on our interactive website, Newark Lead Service Line Replacement.com. So just to give an overview of our water infrastructure and distribution system, we have over 500 miles of distribution pipelines, over 5,000 fire hydrants, close to 10,000 control valves, 80 miles of transmission aqueducts that run through 23 municipalities. Here's a picture of our watershed. This is the Newark watershed, and it has 5 reservoirs with 9 dams and 6 outlet structures. So for this presentation, I will be mainly focusing on the department's stormwater activities. Newark has both separate sanitary sewers and combined sewer systems. Within the city, there are 18 combined sewer overflow structures, and it has 7 netting facilities with 2 stormwater pump stations, 5 stormwater drainage outfalls, and in our southern region of the city, it holds a 4-mile trunk sewer main that transport wastewater directly to the treatment plant from the southern side of the city. As one of the oldest cities in the country, we have very, very old sewer systems that need a considerable upgrade to meet the demands of modern Newark. This is particularly true because the impacts of climate change in Newark have been and will continue to be heavier and harder rainfall, and it can overwhelm certain parts of the city. So over the last several years, the department has been leading significant projects to upgrade its facilities, its water mains, and its fire hydrants. So before I talk a bit about our stormwater management planning activities, I need to provide a brief overview of our regional wastewater treatment utility, which is the Passaic Valley Sewerage Commission, or PVSC. So the PVSC is the largest wastewater treatment facility in the U.S., and it's in our backyard. We always consider the other highly polluting facilities that are in this area, and we also recognize the critical need to ensure that our planned projects mitigate environmental justice concerns, and we don't add to the cumulative burden brought by our fence line communities. So the PVSC also manages some facilities within the city of Newark and parts of the sewer system, and also retains operational control of systems. And sometimes the decisions that they make can increase local flooding in order to increase the functionality of the waste treatment plant. So during a rain event, the PVSC would allow for less flow, resulting in backups on our streets and neighborhoods. Now, I share all of this information up to this point just to give a summary of the conditions that led to Newark's long-term control plan to manage our combined sewer overflow events. Our local commitments are to use natural-based solutions like green infrastructure as widely as possible. The 9 minimum components are identified in the CSO control policy as the minimum technology-based controls that can be used to address our CSO problems that are inexpensive. They don't need a lot of engineering study, and these are implementations prior to the long-term control measures. So for the remainder of my remarks, I'm going to zero in on our green infrastructure efforts. So Newark Sustainable Stormwater Stewards Program is our green infrastructure program geared toward residents, the Rain Barrel Giveaway, and the Adopt a Catch Basin program. So the Rain Barrel Giveaway program is run by the Department of Water and Sewer Utilities. We developed a request for quotes and purchased 95 rain barrels of various sizes to accommodate different settings. So urban gardens, residences, business owners, anyone who wanted to help, keep our streets free of stormwater. We also created some marketing to create consistency, and we also installed these rain barrels ourselves. Currently, due to COVID-19, the program has been on hiatus. So we provide a handout to the rain barrel recipients, which sets the expectation for the care of the device. These installs that you see here are from 2018. Our previous rain barrels were the Ivy rain barrel, which required the downspout cutting. The new round of rain barrels that we have will require a diverter kit, so it will only make a small incision in the downspout for connection to the rain barrel. Our Adopt a Catch Basin program began by identifying priority area basins. The Office of Sustainability developed an application developed an application that included liability relief because, people are on the street cleaning catch basins. So, we have to cover all grounds and be as safe as possible. So they were required to watch an instructional video, which was created by the city's press office. So here's an example of some of our high priority flood zone areas. So we collaborated with artists to incorporate street art. Unfortunately, we are unable to pay artists right now, but in the future, we're working together with the Mayor's Office of Arts and Culture, and they oversee the city's mural program. So our previous examples are done in part to directly engage our Newark residents so that we can make our invisible water infrastructure more visible. So we are in partnership with an environmental justice green infrastructure organization, North DIG, which is North Doing Infrastructure Green. This is also in partnership with Brokers for our green infrastructure pilot projects. If you go on the North DIG website, you can find this map and see all of the completed green infrastructure that's happened throughout the city. We have a few in progress, and there are definitely more being added every day. One of our pilot projects is Clinton Avenue and Badger Avenue, and this is in one of our environmental injustice communities. And this traffic triangle would be replaced with porous pavements, and stormwater planters would be placed there. Here's another traffic triangle that would be implementing the same green infrastructure. This proposed green infrastructure location is near and dear to the Water and Sewer Department because Andrea Adeboale was the previous director of the Water and Sewer Department who passed away in 2018. So we are dedicating this project to her, and it would be in her memory a memorial rain garden. So the city was lucky enough to be funded by a local foundation to participate in 2 peer exchanges with Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and Buffalo, New York. These cities have excelled in their in their journeys for green infrastructure, and we learned a lot from their experiences as we look forward to the implementation of our long-term control plan. So one of the key takeaways was around the risk of missing opportunities to implementing workforce development and job creation into our planning. So based on our experiences, we came back and developed a proposal for funding that allowed us to launch the Newark GreenWorks program. So the Newark GreenWorks program is a green infrastructure training program, which is paid, and it accumulates with the credentials of the National Green Infrastructure Certification Program. We had our first cohort, which was run completely virtually, and this was the first time ever in the country, and I'm eager to see the pass or fail rate within a few months. So this program was run by the Workforce Development Board, who works closely with Newark Alliance 2020 initiatives, the Water Department, and the Sustainability Office. Because of the value of this experience and seeing green jobs as a primary pillar for our planning in the coming years, this program definitely wanted to focus on Newark residents and particularly our reentry second chance population. We also wanted to focus on people who haven't completed their STEM degree from local universities, and our recruitment, who we prioritize people that are already working in landscape and looking to transition and increase their green or environmentally friendly portfolios. So currently we have people in the program who have just finished taking the test and are waiting for their results, and they should be in February or March, give or take. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for those two presentations. I see in the Q&A that we've had a few questions asked and answered already, so I'll skip those. And there's one person with a hand raised I will allow to talk. Fatima Hassani, go ahead. Okay. Okay, so while we're waiting for Fatima, can you jump in? Okay, that doesn't seem to be working. So I'll just start off the discussion with a little question for both of you. I guess I have a question about the original presentation by Nathaly. You were talking about how 2020 has sort of delayed some of these sustainability efforts. But Halimah, in your presentation, you talked about these, so for example, the green jobs initiatives, which when you think of COVID as something that has, it's certainly a public health crisis, but it's also become an economic crisis. I wonder to what extent sort of COVID is sort of creating opportunities or new ways. I mean, Nathaly, you talked about the challenges of herding cats, but is COVID somewhat, has it become in any way sort of a catalyzing effect? Has it sort of brought people together in any way? Wonder if anyone wants to sort of answer that.
Yeah, I'd love to start with this one, and then let's see if Halimah has anything to add as well. But that program, I think, is a perfect example. The Newark GreenWorks program is a perfect example of literally getting folks who had no familiarity previously to work together. And now the Workforce Development Board has gone as far as having green jobs, particularly in the sectors of water and energy, be one of the pillars of their strategic planning going forward. So the reason I say literally had no familiarity is because when we came back from our Buffalo study trip, we basically learned from Push Buffalo about the implementation of their program and learned from, you know, the folks in the Northeast Ohio Sewerage District and the Cleveland area and many other parts of the country that have been doing these kinds of training programs, and fed all of that learning into our proposal to get us the 2-year funding to launch the Newark Green Works program. And in the time between submitting the application in January, winning in July, and then officially launching, we had 4 out of the 5 project partners transition to new jobs. So, and then we actually, because of those transition issues, ended up having to start implementation of that program just as COVID was becoming, you know, I think some of our first meetings as a project team were in January, and we were like training instructors in May and doing all of our starting our actual cohort training sessions in June. So, you know, Franco, the question about like a limited implementation during COVID, I mean, I think we've had some gaps, but certainly the lead service line replacement program proves that we've just been running a mile a minute. And I think that's true of many other programs, including our green infrastructure work that's sort of continued and moved forward, just in a different form. The pauses have been more on the planning side, right? This question of community engagement, which came up in the Q&A. It's very, very challenging to get folks to turn out to meetings at all, which then means that having to do that in a virtual setting has been even more challenging. And that's really more of the remarks that I was describing, is how do you do sort of prioritization of your activities in a way that is really community centered when it's, you know, hard to get people to turn out to meetings. Hope that answers some of your questions, because I mean, we really have been able to bring very disparate partners together for the Green Jobs training program in a way that's been, you know, really rewarding personally.
Thank you. We do have a couple of questions in the Q&A. I don't know, Halimah, if you wanted to say anything on that question, the first question, before we go to those.
Nathaly pretty much covered it. From my point of view, I appreciate that they open the training program to reentry populations. In Newark, I feel that a lot of the youth, you know, 18 years of age youth can benefit from something like this, a program like this, because they have an opportunity to, you know, learn something different. You know, maybe a school setting didn't work for them. You know, maybe they need something more concrete, and, you know, it's paid, so that kind of lures people in to wanna learn something new, and get their foot in the door for green infrastructure. I know I would do it if I had the opportunity to.
Great. There's another question about the coordination with your Superfund sites. To what extent that either the green infrastructure program or the sustainability planning or the climate thinking on climate change, what are the points of connection between Superfund?
Yeah, for being such a small footprint city, we have 4 Superfund sites within our boundaries, including, you know, one of the largest in the country, the Passaic. The sort of, for folks that are familiar with it, the remnants of Agent Orange that was manufactured and then dumped into the river. When it comes specifically to the green infrastructure projects and the ways in which we're managing stormwater, I think the best example that I can come up with in terms of coordination was a very intentional design decision in the development of our riverfront park to sort of elevate certain portions of it so that the sort of pedestrian walkway was helping to manage our climate risks via sort of a tidally influenced elements of the Passaic. That's more of like a coastal wave attenuation strategy. But speaking more broadly, the Office of Sustainability is working very closely with our Environmental Commission on the development and implementation of our Environmental Justice and Cumulative Impacts Ordinance. Might be a good presentation for a future CC1 series is to have members of that commission share a little bit about how we're working on environmental justice and particularly how this city-led ordinance, which was just recently sort of adopted at the statewide scale, first ever in the country, state that is looking at the cumulative burden of pollution impacts in communities and making pollution permit decisions based on those challenges. And that was something that Newark created that ordinance, adopted that ordinance in 2016, and we're in the thick of implementation, not on a regular basis. So I guess high level way of answering that question is that when it comes to the stormwater management activities, I think brownfields is probably a more direct overlay. The location of the Superfund sites is such that they're not necessarily directly connected to our stormwater management efforts. Hope that helps.
That's great. Just relaying another question, probably the last question before we need to move to the next set of presentations. But what is Newark doing anything regarding emissions and in particular sort of vehicle fleets or power generation? Does that factor into any of the long-term planning?
Yeah, thanks. I'll take this one again. Sorry, Halimah. We did not end up talking about that in this presentation. My colleague John Gordon is on the line as well and can possibly sort of unmute himself to answer this question. But our greenhouse gas emissions inventory did find our vehicle fleet to be among the biggest contributors from like a city operational perspective. Is John able to unmute himself, Corinne or Franco?
I just unmuted John. Oh, good. Okay.
Hi. Good afternoon, everyone. So currently, Newark is working on transitioning our fleet of vehicles out, which we have over 1,600 vehicles. Sorry. A majority of those are police vehicles. And another thing that we're looking at is the state has recently allowed for community solar to be developed. And this is a very exciting opportunity for residential property owners, commercial industrial property owners to purchase their electricity from a third party. So there's a lot of really exciting things happening currently in the state, and I hope that answers your question. And we're actively involved.
Quickly note the. Sorry, Johnny.
Sorry, what was that?
Just to quickly note on the second half of Eric's question about power generation, the state of New Jersey recently re-entered the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, and John did some excellent sort of accounting and understanding of the localized impacts to sort of very lightly address another one of the questions that we weren't able to answer about air quality. The Newark Energy Center, which is also located in our backyard, makes up about 10% of the energy generation unit emissions from the state of New Jersey. So I mean, the air quality impacts and the number of vehicles, truck trips that are coming in and out of our neighborhoods on a daily basis is a huge part of the work that we did not focus on with the limited time we had in this presentation.
Thank you. And also, just to add on to that, the reason why Newark has such a large amount of industry is where we are strategically placed along a natural gas pipeline. And this also presents another issue of equity of how our community is built, how this infrastructure is built directly right into our community.
Okay, thanks to all of you. I think just to keep us on schedule, we can move on to the next set of presentations, but I'd invite folks who still have questions for the Newark team to ask them in the Q&A, because we're doing pretty good at answering questions that aren't addressed in the conversation in the Q&A. So with that, I'd like to sort of thank the two speakers from Newark. And let's move on to the Baltimore presentations. So we have two speakers, and I'll introduce the speakers maybe while they get their presentation up. So Lisa McNeilly is the Director of Sustainability for the City of Baltimore, where she works toward a more sustainable, equitable, and resilient city. Previously, she was the Director of Sustainability at UC Berkeley, where she served as Program Director for the Nature Conservancy, managed sustainability and compliance at the Grand Canyon, and directed international programs at the Pew Center on Global Climate Change. Sorry, I mixed that up. She was at UC Berkeley Nature Conservancy and did the work at the Grand Canyon and Pew. And that she will be our first speaker. And then we have Kim Grove, who's a professional engineer with more than 20 years of experience spanning the spectrum of civil engineering, including stormwater management, land development design, environmental site assessment and remediation, geotechnical engineering and forensic analysis, construction management and materials testing. Kim currently serves as the chief for the Office of Compliance and Research, which is committed to enhancing environmental regulatory compliance for the department through collaboration, management, program improvements, and regulatory enforcement. So my understanding is that this will be a tag team presentation. So with that, I'll hand it over to Lisa and Kim.
Okay, thank you and good afternoon. So this presentation is a joint presentation between the Department of Public Works and Baltimore's Office of Sustainability, focusing not only on resilience planning, but planning through partnership. For those of you who are not familiar with the city of Baltimore, I like to think of us as being built on the water. We are a port city, which means that we aren't only relying on the port industries, but also those railways and interstates that allow those goods to be transported out of the city. We're about 82 square miles and our population is about 620,000 people, but it peaked in the 1950s when we had most of the population build out. At that time, we were about 1 million in population, and we had most of our water infrastructure already built out as well. One thing of note is that the city of Baltimore is an independent municipality. We are not part of a county. We are separate and work as a city. And as a city, we demonstrate an ultra-urban environment. This is our downtown area, which means that we have a lot of impervious cover. We have a lot of utilities that are underneath, as well as our buried streams. But we also have a huge sense of neighborhoods. We have over 200 neighborhoods within the city, and each of those neighborhoods feel like they have a unique identity and a unique voice. So for the Department of Public Works, we are a local government agency that can also operate a bit like a regional water utility, providing drinking water not only to the residents of Baltimore City, but also the surrounding counties. Our wastewater system not only collects from the city and Baltimore County, but we also operate 2 wastewater treatment plants, which are the 2 largest in the state. In addition to that, the city of Baltimore is completely separate, meaning we are regulated fully as an MS4 community. And since we had most of our build out occurring in the 1950s prior to the Clean Water Act, that means that we don't have a lot in the way of best management practices or stormwater controls. Most of our streams were buried in pipes to allow the growth of the city. And we do have some coastline, but most of that coastline is really hardscaped. Now, in addition to all of these water services, the Department of Public Works also has a Bureau of Solid Waste that provides routine services for collection of municipal solid waste and recycling. We also operate a landfill and a transfer station, plus community drop-off centers. In addition to all of those services, we provide routine street sweeping, manage the corner cans, and do a lot related to property management for vacant lots, including rat abatement. And now I'll turn it over to Lisa so she can introduce the Office of Sustainability. Hopefully. Lisa, if you're talking, we can't hear you.
Sorry, I was holding down my space bar and it didn't work. So much for me doing what technology tells me I can do. Thanks, Kim. Hopefully you all, especially if I learn to unmute myself, you'll learn to be able to either hear the difference between Kim and mine's voice, or hopefully we'll have done a good enough collaborative presentation that it won't actually matter. So the Office of Sustainability is in the planning department, and we've been around since 2007. We kind of grew up, it was a staff-led effort to create the office, starting sort of, I think, with kind of more of a land use, environmental permitting perspective, and then were created and sort of institutionalized as an office through city code. And we are required then by the city council to create a sustainability plan and to work towards, a more sustainable and resilient city with that plan that is citywide, not just a city government approach. And so the other nice part about what we have to offer is that we do have a 21-member, mostly community commission on sustainability that helps us with the plan and with the reporting requirements. Next slide.
So for local government, a lot of times to be able to provide that service, it does feel like this never-ending pushing of the stone up the hill. But it has some challenges, and including my technology challenges. So it has some challenges in the sense of the regulations that feels like it's just a never-ending combat. Affordability, which is a great concept, but there's not a lot of visibility of what that means. Politics can sometimes feel like it kicks us in the shin, but mostly it's climate that can really feel like a challenge with a sense of humor. So our weather-related disasters come in many forms, and Lisa can talk a little bit more about what you're seeing in these photos.
Yeah, so we have, I think like many cities in the mid-Atlantic, our sort of highest hazards that we worry about are wind, whether it's the straight line wind that we occasionally see like hit in the Midwest this summer, or hurricanes or tornadoes, extreme weather other extreme weather events of significant rainfall, significant heat, significant cold or snowfall, and then the flooding that sometimes can come both from sea level rise and from these rain events. And one of the things that we know the science tells us is that the climate change is going to make that riverine flooding, that precipitation driven flooding, worse much more quickly than it is the sea level rise. And so that drives a lot of the work that Kim does and the planning that my office does. Next slide.
So the planning factors really come into what you can control and what you can't. Obviously, we can't control weather and climate. We share our watersheds with the surrounding county. And as I noted before, we're an independent municipality, so we don't have control over what they are doing in those headwaters. And what we really have a hard time controlling is human behavior. But what we can do is we can establish design standards, we can make decisions related to land use and development. And of course, we can establish what our projects will be, whether they are capital projects or operation enhancements. So in the city of Baltimore, we are small, but we notice a lot of variation, especially with rainfall. And we have a series of rain gauges and stream level gauges throughout the city as part of a flood alert system. And what this slide is demonstrating is that there's still a lot of spatial variation. I just pulled out 4 of our gauges within the flood alert system, comparing that to a site at the Baltimore Washington International Airport, which is managed by the National Weather Service. So the table at the top is showing information for both fiscal years 19 and 20. And for us, our fiscal year goes from July to June. And what you'll notice, or the big takeaways from this, is that for total rainfall, we can have a variability of almost 11 inches. Didn't matter which year, 11 inches across the city. And more importantly, that variability is not always in the same place. One other thing of note is the number of days that we'll have with rainfall that is greater than 1 inch. And a lot of times that rainfall, that 1 inch, is falling not over 24 hours, but over the course of only 1 to 2 hours. The box to the right, talking about our top events, these are the top 10 events for fiscal year 2020. And what you'll notice is that in the summertime, those top events are only occurring within one specific location. So it's acting more like a microcell. And that event on August 6, 2019, that was one that those 4 inches fell within only about an hour and a half. More importantly, the National Weather Service, their rain gauge was showing less than 1/10 of an inch. Had they not been connected to our flood alert system, they would not have recognized this event, which was actually categorized as an emergency, and we had to bring FEMA in to address a lot of claims that were resulting from that flooding. One other thing to point out is, if you'll notice, we have a lot more of those events that are greater than 1 inch, that are our top 10, that are occurring during the late fall to early spring. And those are usually your dormant season for vegetation. So as we try to think through of how we want to address rainfall and flooding, the approach of using green infrastructure and vegetative practices have to be considering when these major rainstorms are occurring. So I talked a little bit about microburst events, and this is just some of the data that we are able to pull out from our rain gauges. This was a specific event that happened on July 11, 2019. It occurred towards the north part of our city. And just north of our city is a large lake. It's along a river known as the Jones Falls. So the storm itself wasn't too crazy. It was about 1.5 inches of rainfall, but that 1.5 inches occurred in only 30 minutes. After that, we didn't have much more rain happening. But to the right, you'll see a graph of the stream levels that we have. The blue line is to the north of the city at Mount Washington. Union Avenue is an area that has a lot of commercial development. And then the streetcar museum is further south, and that is before the Jones Falls goes into a series of tunnels. So I had told you before that we had only 30 minutes of rain, and that water level had peaked right around an hour to an hour and 15 minutes. Okay, so that's normal. And then it started to recede. But then it came back up again. And one thing I want to point out is that first peak is about 7 feet within an hour. So that's 7 feet of water level rise within an hour. And you want to take that into consideration when you're trying to think about flood prevention, how much notice the property owners need to be able to prepare. In Maryland, and working with National Weather Service, a lot of times at best, we may only get 80 to 90 minutes of enough of a warning. And so sometimes we don't even get that much. For this particular storm, we had to actually evacuate the area around Union Avenue about not at the time of the first peak, but as we were going to that second peak and when we passed over that 6-foot rise. So that's why it's real important that when we're talking about resiliency, that we take into consideration how we're going to be able to watch and monitor. And I highly would recommend making sure that you're having a significant number of monitoring stations to be able to watch that, because microburst events are becoming more prevalent, especially in urban areas. So it's not always about what falls from the sky, but what is happening on the land. So I'm just going to forewarn you that the next few slides are going to have a lot of maps, so just be ready for that. This one is demonstrating this connection, this spatial connection that you can see within the city between vacant properties and then the number of reported dirty streets and alleys, and how that aligns with also the reports of clogged storm drains. So when we were talking about human behavior, the sense of ownership and I won't necessarily say pride, but feelings towards the neighborhood seem to go hand in hand with occurrences of flooding due to clogged infrastructure. Lisa's going to now talk a little bit about the heat island effect that we see.
And so this is, thanks Kim, this is another sort of twin set of maps. I apologize, they're from two different sources, so they're not as nicely lined up as Kim's were, but on the left is a study that was done of where we have the highest urban heat island effect. And just with the rainfall, we have a lot of variability. In this particular study, the temperature ranged almost 10 degrees. We've had others that have found neighborhoods where those differentials were even greater. You can see in that map on the right then how the impact of that heat island effect and how it can be connected to the child asthma emergency visits that we have. Next slide. And so this is then kind of the inverse of the heat island. So this is where we have a greater tree canopy, given that we know that obviously trees cool and that heat island can be caused by having more pervious surface. But in this case, wanted to sort of highlight how that connects to, you can see the correlation with the higher concentrations of poverty. And you know, I think I think many people might be familiar with these maps of Baltimore. These are not dissimilar to the maps of redlining that we've seen, and a whole history of disinvestment and structural racism in the city. But it is still worth not, I think digging in and sort of seeing these individual factors and making these comparisons as we're as Kim does the planning that she does, and as we look to how to respond to the disasters. Next slide.
So who's responsible for resiliency? Within the city government structure, DPW is a part of it, Office of Sustainability, but also our Department of General Services, Transportation, Health Department, Emergency Services, your usual cast of characters come in. But for us, we recognize that it's just more than government agencies. We have to recognize that our residents are both responsible and interested in resiliency. And with those residents, it's also the religious institutions that are a part of it. And they tend to be more of having the ear with the mayor of Baltimore. Our businesses and industrial properties, they tend to have that responsibility, but also that connection and both influencing and being influenced by decisions of the Department of Public Works and the Department of Transportation. One thing to recognize is that the city, though, has this permanent population, and then we also have a bit of a transient population, and that's due to our 9 universities and colleges within the city. City of Baltimore is also well known for their medical facilities and hospitals that attract a lot of people who who are only coming in for a short amount of time. And then of course, the tourism and sports that we attract, especially with our football and baseball teams. And so when we're trying to make decisions on what we need to be doing for planning, we want to take that other population into consideration as well, not only in the movement of them through the city, but also how they may influence some of the practices that we are trying to develop. So land access, and this is when we're talking about those private entities, land access is a good thing for considering it. Whether we're talking about stormwater management or trying to improve air quality, a lot of us go through the same exercise. We may be looking for potential projects by doing a GIS desktop analysis. We identify those priority sites. We even go out to the field. But the reality is what we can construct compared to what we may find in a desktop analysis is very, very different. And I can tell you for the city of Baltimore, for stormwater management, we have found that once we've identified priority sites, those sites that can actually be constructed, it's about a 10-to-1 ratio. So that's a lot of effort on the planning side to what you may actually be able to do. And a lot of that is due to land ownership. The city only owns about 6% of, or responsible for 6% of the impervious area outside the right-of-way. That right-of-way is a big chunk of the impervious area within the city, but it's already putting in a function of moving people, of having a lot of utilities underneath. So it's a very difficult space to put in any kind of practices that may be able to address and build in resiliency. So then once you take out the state and federal properties, you really want to look then at that other side, and that's your single family residential properties, your commercial and multifamily properties, and even those properties that may be managed by nonprofit entities like churches and synagogues. So now Lisa's going to talk a little bit about, now that we recognize for us to be able to get to those properties, or at least to talk about the management of those lands, how do you engage that? And so she's going to tell a little bit of the story of the sustainability plan update.
Yes, thanks, Kim. So as I mentioned at the top, the sustainability plan is something that we're required by our city council to have, and it's a large plan that kind of is an umbrella over even some other plans we're going to talk about later today. And we tried to do a much deeper sort of community engagement as we did that update. We took, and again, I think some of what we did parallels some of what Nathaly was talking about for their climate action. But we went and engaged residents as ambassadors, where we worked with them and trained them, and they helped us actually design the engagement. They helped bring in over 1,000 resident surveys, excuse me. But we, of course, we also brought in subject matter experts through working groups and through some different public comment periods. And we're planning, so this was for our sustainability plan that was broader than climate. And what we're, just like Nathaly talked about, are going to be working to figure out how to best do this as we do an update to our climate action plan and to our disaster preparedness plan, which we're going to talk a little bit more about in a minute. Next slide. And one of the ways that one very high priority for us as we do this planning and the engagement is to have an equity lens. And so we did that with the process of the update and tried to embed equity in the content of the plan, but also wanted to make sure that as we implement the strategies or as we get started on them, that we have a way to also improve the equitable outcomes of the work. And so we have these guidelines that we've used, but the part of the key point I wanted to make here is about this targeted universal strategy that is a way of how you get started, which projects or which strategies even that really address the needs of sort of everyone, but really does allow you to pay a particular attention to situation of a group that might have been marginalized in Baltimore, in case the African-American neighborhoods. And we hope to, or we don't hope to, we plan to implement this again in future plans. Next slide.
So this was actually one of my favorite slides to create for this presentation, because I started to think through what has been our timeline of resilience building. And I started to recognize that it may have been started because of certain regulations, whether it's an MS4 permit or the city adopting, putting into the city code that a sustainability plan need to be created. But as the decades progressed, what I started to recognize was not only had the efforts been increased, whether they were new policies, new plans, actual projects being done, but more to the point, especially in the last decade, it was the number of outside entities that were also taking a large role. We included nonprofit organizations. We actually had a benefits district within the city take it upon themselves to create the Healthy Harbor Plan. And they're actually they were responsible for installing the infamous water wheel for the trash wheel, Mr. Trash Wheel, which has a better social media following than most of us do. I guess that's what googly eyes can get to you. But it was really incredible to see that the speed keeps increasing. So I'm very excited to be able to be a part of what that next decade will look like. Not only additional projects being in, but my expectation is to have more partners. And it's more than just the NGOs. As you'll notice, suddenly in Maryland within 2010 to 2020, we started having professional organizations like WEF and ASCE having stormwater focused committees that were routinely providing technical meetings and presentations. We also became one of the pilot locations for the Urban Waters Federal Partnership. So it wasn't just US Forest Service who had started to be a good partner for us in the 1990s, but now we have EPA, we have NOAA, we had HUD. We had a lot of other federal agencies wanting to work together to help improve the Baltimore region. And these initiatives were not just focused on water, but they also included solid waste and in some places energy. So this is just an example of how that partnership alignment worked. We have, I had noted before, we have a vacancy issue in the city, much like other urban areas. And there was a program called Vacants to Value, which had different goals set in mind. And in some of it, it was to try and consolidate the vacant lands, be able to demolish it. So instead of trying to sell off or make different small lots be appealing, you could see the whole block be appealing. And because of some of the interventions with the Office of Sustainability, instead of doing mass demolition, they started to work on doing deconstruction, which means instead of a sledgehammer, you have a fine chisel and being able to pull out some of the materials that eventually could be sold. And that's the Waste to Wealth program. A great example of that is a team through Humanum started to get the contracts for deconstruction. They had a workforce development program for returning citizens, and the materials that they were pulling out, which included brick and yellow pine, which was over 100 years old, was now a commodity that could be sold. And so that was really working out well, but not all of those materials could be sold, but they didn't necessarily have to go to the landfill. They could be diverted. Along those same times, we had the Urban Waters Federal Partnership that I noted. They put money into developing a green pattern book by the Department of Planning. And to test that pattern book, we were looking at the Growing Green initiative and doing a design competition. And through that design competition, we were also going to work out a lot of the kinks that may have been there as part of the permitting process when communities wanted to do something as a volunteer for cleaning and greening, not just having to do it as a development requirement. And then again, in that same aligned period, the city had a new MS4 permit and we were under the Chesapeake Bay TMDL program, meaning that we had a lot of regulatory requirements. So in 2013, we established the stormwater fee to have a sustainable funding source. And as part of that fee, we also were going to be issuing grants to NGOs and community members to be able to be a partner with us. But what we recognized both with the Growing Green initiative and the grants was that a pattern book and some money was not enough. And that's where the idea of the Growth Center came in. The Growth Center is still a concept. We've tested things out with a couple pilot pop-ups, but the idea is to be able to not just give money, but to provide tools, materials, those materials that would have been otherwise going to a landfill, and technical assistance to these communities and private entities so that they are better enabled to be a partner in putting green and clean resources into the community. Along the lines of or following the lead with the Office of Sustainability and looking at the equity lens, the Department of Public Works started to look at our watershed assessments, and we wanted to go beyond the typical EPA A through I criteria of really just looking at the physical things like the soils and what the water chemistry is. And so we developed assessments for 2 of our watersheds along the harbor that also included some prioritization mapping, taking into consideration equity and health. Think beyond just what the environment is, but also the community that it supports. So now Lisa's going to talk about the DP3 project.
Yeah, so our DP3 is what we call the plan that is both meets the requirements of the FEMA All Hazard Mitigation Plan, which I think many of the jurisdictions may be familiar with, but also our climate adaptation plan, sort of how we are kind of planning more broadly around infrastructure and buildings and public services to adapt to climate change, but to prepare for hazards. And our goals, again, are to prevent damage, but also to kind of to build resilience in the face of these challenges. Next slide. The process for the plan kind of takes us through identifying the hazards, making sure that we understand what our vulnerabilities are to those hazards, doing an assessment of the impacts. And these end up being fairly technical components that are really driven by what the FEMA requirements and guidance are. But it's in the plan development that we planners got to have a little bit of fun in terms of, maybe not fun's the right word, but we got to be a little bit more innovative in terms of looking at sort of what our visions could be, what the strategies could be, and how to prioritize them. And we've ended up with, over 200 different steps that we could take. We prioritized about 100 of them as being some of the highest priority. And these are things that people in the city can do, but we also we sort of went a bit out of our lane perhaps and identified things that we thought even other state agencies needed to have the lead on to help us really be more prepared for these disasters. Next slide. One of the outgrowths of that plan is the kind of partnership that our office has with DPW and with Kim as we respond to the kinds of disasters that we've been seeing. I mean, these are the photo there of a train explosion or train derailment, and an explosion was back in 2001. But even just in recent times, we've had nuisance flooding, which is the sea level rise, the more tidal driven sea level rise 12 times in 2019, which was a record. Some of the floods that Kim mentioned, a sinkhole, a snow emergency, multiple extreme cold events. And so this is not, this plan, while it's long and technical, is relevant on a regular basis for us. Next slide. But one of the things we are doing, again, in this eye towards updating the plan for the next go around, in addition to using an equity lens, we really want to broaden our outreach even more than, and to try to mirror what we did with the sustainability plan, and integrate man-made hazards. Besides the fact that Baltimore was a victim of ransomware, the train derailment I mentioned is actually one of two examples that FEMA gives as to why jurisdictions might want to address these man-made hazards, and really sort of take a community resilience approach to how we do this. That as Kim mentioned, we are a city of neighborhoods, and we know we have these scars and these fault lines in the cities. And so to the extent that we can look at the hazards and look at these vulnerabilities and dive down into a neighborhood basis, we think that's going to help us be more targeted and but also more effective in the kind of work that we do. We're also looking to really make sure that this plan addresses food access, but also hazard mitigation for many reasons, especially the flooding. But if you go, next slide, this community planning that I mentioned has led us to creating resiliency hubs. We have either 8 or 9 right now. We're in the process of finalizing an MOU with one, that are these community groups that were already in existence that we've partnered with to connect them to the city, to maybe do to help with the fundraising and the supplies, but also to provide training to them. One of the things we're also doing is hopefully getting as many of them as possible outfitted with solar power and battery storage, again, so that it's not just this kind of a community resilience, but a physical resilience, so that they might be able to stay open in the power outages that are caused by the wind and the hurricanes and other events. And this has been a really popular program. These hubs have really stepped up during the pandemic, mostly around food access, but also some of them have been COVID testing sites. Some have also been, even outside of the pandemic, been resource centers around flooding that's happened in their neighborhoods. And the map on the right is an example of some of that community resiliency planning that I mentioned. This is looking at single parent households and with young children and heat vulnerability. And so again, you can see that ghost of the redlining here, but you can also see that there are perhaps some very particular neighborhoods where we might have a vulnerability, where it can really help us as we're trying to set up the programs, whether it's increasing the tree canopy or even finding cooling resources that can be made available. Next slide.
So we're going to just give you a couple of examples of how we've worked through some partnerships specifically addressing flooding. The first one is around Frederick Avenue, and this is a location that 2016 and 2018, the nation turned its cameras to Ellicott City, but that same storm flooded a neighborhood in West Baltimore. And unfortunately, there are stories of how those TV news cameras went and drove right past this flooding to get to Ellicott City. So if I were to show you some of the information on that, the one in 2018, water levels within the stream rose 8.5 feet within 45 minutes. So there was less than an hour before the start of the storm to when the streets were flooding. And it caused significant roadway damage. A lot of flooded basements and evacuations and water vehicle rescues were needed. And it wasn't just those 1 or 2 events in 2016 and 2018. We had events like that again in 2020, especially with vehicle rescues. So in 2018, during the community meetings where the community was with all rights upset because this was something that was continually happening with them, they said, what are you going to do? So Department of Public Works and the Office of Emergency Management and DOT and planning all worked together to try and find funds and technical assistance. And this came through the Silver Jackets program through the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, which works with federal and state agency to provide technical expertise. Now, why we were able to get this technical resource was not just because, hey, we want to look at an alternatives analysis, but we also wanted to work with them on developing flood-proofing guidance that would be more representative of the types of properties and the property occupants that were in this area. Because a lot of the flood-proofing guidance is there for detached single-family homes where the owner of the home is who occupies it. So we got the assistance. We've also been getting other grants to be coming in, and that's a lot of heavy lifting by by government agencies. But at the same time, the Still Meadow Church became a resiliency hub. They offered to take their 9 acres of private forested land to create that as a peace park that in turn is becoming an experimental urban forest with the U.S. Forest Service. And they've been a great partner with us as just being a conduit to the 9 different community leaders that we have to work with as we are doing these assessments and flood proofing for long-term planning and trying to reduce the occurrence of flooding in this area along the Maiden's Choice. Another example is in the south part of Baltimore around the Cherry Hill neighborhood, which is the first and last planned neighborhood specifically for African Americans. That was created in the 1940s. And then in the 1950s, a lot of those properties were transferred to being just public housing. And what happens is that within any event that may be over 1.5 inches of rain in a very short duration of time, usually our emergency services will have to mobilize and evacuate those residents, especially in a particular area. What we started to look at within Department of Public Works was to assess the pipe network system. And we recognized that the existing pipe network would not work, but that we couldn't replace it in the alignment that it had. We have to do a realignment. And then we also wanted to look at adding certain green infrastructure projects that could be done and expanding some of our inlet cleaning and trash reduction efforts, because even if we realigned the pipes, we were still noticing a lot of debris and trash accumulation occurring in it. Now, concurrent to all of these efforts is a quasi-government group called the South Baltimore Gateway. And they have started to work on a middle branch master plan, which is going to allow the residents of the area, including Cherry Hill, to have more connections to green spaces, expanded green spaces, but also how we may be able to look at introducing living shorelines along this area that are not only going to help improve water quality, but could also assist us in addressing sea level rise. And so that's been a really good partnership that's still at the beginning of the phases. We're still in a lot of the planning, but my expectation is that over the next 10 years, it could be very transformative for the area. So the last thought, so when we're talking about resilience planning, is that resiliency isn't a one-time and done. It's got to be essential to local government services, and that we need to make these connections of not just addressing what resiliency means to water, but how they can interplay and interconnect, especially when you look at that nexus of water, waste, and energy. And these aren't just related to the environmental elements. We have to consider those man-made elements. Of course, all of these efforts that any local government agency tries to do is going to be falling short if you don't have a strong partnership and connection with private property owners, private entities, NGOs, just anybody that wants to be a partner with you. And last but not least is, I want to reflect that Lisa has been talking a lot about the upgrades to existing plans, and that is actually a wonderful thing. We're no longer just trying to create the plans. We are really in an adaptive management scenario and working through practicing a lot of the elements that we've started to put into those plans. And so with that, I am going to thank you very much for your time, for listening to us. Hopefully we still have some time for questions, and I will then stop sharing my screen.
Thank you so much to both of you. Those are great presentations. And a lot of connections to what we were talking about earlier with Newark. Some of the questions have been sort of flying through the Q&A. I think we've answered some of these. There was a question about the coordination between the Office of Sustainability and Emergency Management, but I think some of that was discussed already, although I opened that up for one point of discussion. I'll sort of touch a couple of topics here. There was another question here about sort of the sort of doomsday scenario, sea level rise predictions, and if they're, you know, how far, I guess, your planning goes out into the future and thinking about some of those conditions. So I don't know, maybe if any of you want to say anything on those points, and then we can go forward. I think there was also one attendee who had a hand raised, but she put them down. But do you have any thoughts on those?
So this is Lisa. I was typing a quick answer. Sorry, I couldn't have to answer some of the questions while we were doing the presentation, but and Kim may be able to chime in on anything related to kind of stormwater and you know, the saltwater intrusion into the systems or anything. You know, a lot of our shoreline is hardened, and so we do work to kind of manage development along the rest of it, so that hopefully it can, you know, be a green space that can help sort of accommodate the sea level rise. We know that one of our main kind of partners on resiliency, our port, also has gotten some money to sort of elevate some of their facilities. But it is still, it's still a very daunting challenge, and you know, it is we are working towards trying to understand, you know, what are some of the other projects that we can do. Kim?
So in addition to the inundation mapping that's been done, one of the major projects that the city has undertaken is a project called the Headworks Project, which is a large pumping project for our Back River wastewater treatment plant. And that isn't necessarily to try and get to the future, but to try and catch up to the present, because the pipe that is a very simplified representation of the project is that the pipe coming into the wastewater treatment plant is much lower than the treatment process. So we're having to have these large pumps to be able to reduce that backup that was occurring across almost 10 miles of the sanitary sewer. But when we were looking at it, we wanted to forecast forward. That being said, I think a lot of what our focus has been within the Department of Public Works is less about the doomsday of sea level rise and more about the doomsday of what we will be considering as our certain design storms going into both 2050 and 2080. And I was really thankful for the project that I worked with Franco in trying to see what some of those climate scenarios could be. And as we are making those investments in replacing our pipes and our infrastructure, are we making sure that we're sizing it not for right now, but for 100 years from now?
Great, thanks. There's another question here about coordination with power utilities or utility regulators with respect to resiliency. So for example, are electricity providers accounting for increasing urban heat island or anything that has to do with social vulnerability in terms of thinking about sort of a resilient energy supply going forward. And I'll just piggyback that with one of the other questions that I had, which was, you know, the portfolio of projects, the impressive portfolio of projects presented are, a lot of them have to do with sustainability and adaptation, but where does mitigation fit in the thinking and in the activities of your offices, as well as with the resilience hubs?
So this is Lisa. So just to clarify, when you say mitigation, you mean like reducing greenhouse gas emissions?
Yes, I'm sorry. That's what I meant. Yes.
No.
You know, yes. Yeah.
I only asked to clarify. It was a conversation I had just earlier this week with our climate resilience planner about how mitigation kind of gets used in not so much in completely different ways, but in, for both hazard mitigation from the FEMA language and then climate mitigation of reducing emissions. Yes, we do work with our utility company. Our local utility is on our Commission on Sustainability. That's an area where I need to know more in terms of, what they're doing around a resilient energy supply. I mean, we're thinking about that for the hubs, but again, that's on a very hyper local framework. But our utility is fairly progressive, and we're at the beginning of some of those conversations. I think with some new leadership there. On the climate change, on reducing emissions, we tend to, when I think about that and when we frame it, we tend to frame it very much in terms of what might normally be called the co-benefits, sort of the reduced cost and what it can mean in terms of energy or utility burden to individual households. And we have not really gotten to that point with the resiliency hubs, with the exception in terms of, we haven't gotten there in terms of their outreach to the people in their community. We have worked with them, and for several of them, we've been able to help secure grant funding to help them increase their energy efficiency, and so have lower, the lower cost, but also the lower emissions. And we're hoping that the grants that we've used are going to be able to continue.
And I just want to also note that within the city government structure, there is an Office of Sustainable Energy that has looked at both our fleet as well as our buildings in trying to reduce some of the energy demands, look at using electric vehicles wherever possible, and also being able to deploy grants to other businesses so that they can also adopt those practices.
Great, thank you. Kim, I see that you wanted to answer the question about litter and first flush and impact of that on water quality. Did you want to say anything on that point?
Actually, can you repeat that question? I was trying to answer another one and none of them were allowing me to answer. So technology works until it doesn't. What's the specific question?
Oh, no, this was a question, actually the person has left, but the question was when you were talking about the litter areas, it was a question about the water quality implication of the litter for Baltimore.
So Baltimore City is very unique in that we are one of 4 locations in the United States with a trash TMDL. So it's not even looking at the first flush, but we do have an issue and an impairment with trash and litter and floatables. It's not always a first flush. It's not always about how much impervious area or what kind of rainfall is happening, because trash and litter is a it's a human behavior. It is it's a social pollutant more than anything else. And so one of the things that we're trying to get to is just having a better understanding of where and how that accumulation happens. We've had certain studies done by Johns Hopkins University and some of our environmental NGOs looking at where does this happen? You know, we're seeing more trash and litter occurring where there's carryouts or within a proximity of bus stops. So it makes it a little bit more harder than what you would do with other pollutants, where you could just look at how land usage or land cover is working and start to estimate what those pollutants would be like, because trash is not that same way. But we have started to put in certain programs. The city distributed municipal trash cans to all residents in 2017. We are constantly looking for resources for also the recycling to be added to that. We started to put some of the screens, we expanded our street sweeping. But again, it's one of those, especially with trash, it's one of those things that if we do not have that partnership, we're never going to meet the goal.
Thanks for that. So we have about 5 minutes left, and I was just wondering if we could get all 4 speakers back on, perhaps for maybe a closing conversation. I'm not sure if any of the Newark speakers wanted to sort of react to some of the Baltimore presentation, or vice versa, or if there are any more additional questions from the Q&A. I think we do have some Q&A that just popped up, but let's Newark folks, did you, Nathaly, Halimah, did you want to sort of address the Baltimore team at all? Okay, so we're not hearing anything. Let's open it up.
Apologies, Franco, I was muted. I was just
no problem.
gushing about. I was just saying it's funny to have been muted in that moment, because I was like, Lisa knows how much I love her. I think Baltimore does some fantastic work, and I've been a big fan of the DP3. Hey, I'm sorry, my camera's off. But in any case, Kim, I particularly love that slide that shows sort of the duration of time sort of dedicated to this work. One of the things that Lisa and I are both members of the Urban Sustainability Directors Network, and I'm often looking at that scale of like all of us doing this work together across the country, and what that means in terms of our approaches and what we replicate from each other. There's this sort of swell of what I'm going to call like the next front of cities, Newark being one of them, that have sort of been doing this work for less time and or with fewer resources. So I'm an office of 2. It's myself and John, and then we've got the distribution with other departments, Halimah being a perfect example of folks that we collaborate with. But when you have a very small team and, you know, next to no budget to do this work, you have to really think creatively about how to do all this stuff. And so it's so impressive to me always to see the variety of programs that are happening. In Baltimore in particular is one of those cities that I keep looking to. So I appreciate all of these presentations. And Kim, I'm not sure if we've had a chance to meet yet, but lovely to hear your voice and to hear your slide deck.
And I just want to give a shout out to Newark and to Nathaly and John. So they've been, even though we've already have this climate action plan and are on an update, you know, they've gotten started before us and have some really great ideas that they've done around that engagement. And we've already reached out and to learn more and to try to maybe replicate some of those best practices. So we love Newark too.
Great. Let's see, just some closing questions here. Maybe I'll just open it to any of the folks who are, I'm having trouble sort of scanning the questions at the same time that I'm monitoring the chat. So if any of those folks want to raise their hand, we can do that. I'm sort of curious about the idea of the resilience hubs, which are, you know, I've heard in different contexts, even Drexel's even considering a resilience hub right here on our campus. is the Resilience Hub concept sort of operating in Newark as well?
No, not yet. It's certainly an idea that I'd love to try and explore. The sort of there's a number of folks that have developed sort of like resources about how to form a resilience hub, and this idea of sort of having the full operational control be owned outside of government, be owned by a local partner, means that you really need, to the comment that Kim made previously about the faith community, for example, like you really need that leadership from local groups. So we have sort of, I'm not sure that I would call them resilience hubs, because I feel like my own mental definition of that is very specific. But we do have a number of initiatives led by other groups that center around specific buildings, but they don't have that, operability during disaster, that microgrid structure, like all of those physical structural elements aren't necessarily part of the way the variety of partners, CBO partners doing work on the ground is operating. I'm not sure, Lisa and Kim, if that's, a specific part of how you label something resilience hub is ability to function during shock event.
Well, we had we started with a list of attributes, and it proved to be a very high bar, but it also proved to be one that we didn't necessarily have to always meet, and have found that embracing sort of a diversity of hubs, of circumstances for sort of the hub leaders has really seemed to work well. So we have a lot of faith-based organizations. We have some that are smaller, some that are bigger, some that paid for their own, got their own money for solar and battery storage. Some like Still Meadow, that where Kim mentioned that have land near them, that they've opened up this peace park. And what we're finding is that that's okay. Our preference is still for, we do still need somebody to have a building and to have, a presence in a neighborhood. But we're working to sort of meet all the hubs sort of where they are, and find the way to support a range of different characteristics.
I also wanted to add one point that I've learned an awful lot about, especially with the work with Still Meadow, is that when we talk about resiliency planning, a lot of times we focus on preparation and response. But in that recovery period, it's more than just putting the pavement back into place. We've had a lot of discussions related to trauma, especially with repeat experiences related to flooding. And that's one of the reasons why the Peace Park was created, so that this green space could be a way to start addressing trauma.
Really interesting. Unfortunately, we're out of time. All of these discussions could go on, and I really hope that we can continue in other ways to talk to you, all four of you, about this important work. And but unfortunately, we're out of time. So I want to just thank all of you for giving us your time and your thoughts and your ideas on this important topic. And please stay in touch and join us for next month's presentation. And thanks to all of our participants and questions. It was a really rich discussion. So stay safe, and we'll see you next month.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.